It is the biggest rebel offensive against the Assad regime in years. Thousands of insurgents have reportedly entered Syria's second biggest city, Aleppo. The lightning offensive took government forces by surprise, but experts say the rebels are predictably seizing international momentum. With dozens killed and thousands displaced in a matter of days, the fighting in Syria's northwest is a sharp escalation in a war that had all but slipped off the international radar. Is another major conflict about to flare back up in the Middle East? I'm Nicole Furlich in Berlin, and this is The Day.
Ibrahim Al-Assil is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington. He was a founding member of the Syrian non-violence movement in 2011 and was consequently detained by the Syrian secret police. Ibrahim, welcome to the program. I wonder if I can start by asking you how you think it is that Damascus was apparently taken by surprise by this rebel offensive.
Thank you for having me, Anthony. I think I'm surprised that the Damascus forces and leadership was surprised because we've seen indicators over the months that HTS was building up for such an offense. What I think was really surprising is the rapid collapse of the regime forces around Aleppo. Many expected that HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham, would be able to control different parts outside Aleppo in the country side of the city, but nobody expected them to be able to go inside the city and to control neighborhoods that they didn't and they couldn't even control over the last 10 years and at the peak of their strength when they were able to control half of the city before the regime claimed it back closer to 2020.
Ibrahim, as someone who suffered at the hands of this regime, is it tempting to read into this that Assad's forces might be losing their grip on the security situation?
Many people among those who are fighting today, they are fighters who just want to go back home. Many of them are fighters who just don't want to be detained and tortured. However, that's not the full picture. There are also people, or there are also fighters who are radicals and who are militants among HTS and who are also oppressing other people. So I don't see this as a step towards liberation. I think it's a change in the balance of power. Many people have hope. Many people are really afraid of what will happen next. But many people, and I think most Syrians, have a mix of both feelings, and they are contradicting feelings. But many Syrians are worried about what's going to happen tomorrow, and they are just afraid that this will intensify the fighting. And sooner or later, there will be airstrikes by the regime, and there will be another cycle of violence that takes place inside Syria.
And that speaks to my next question. It's so hard to generalise. Do the rebel forces, some apparently with jihadist ideology, have the support of the people in Aleppo?
That's a very complicated question because while so many people do want to get rid of the regime, and I've seen some videos and pictures of people being freed from the political presence under the secret police in different parts of Aleppo, there are also many people who are very worried about the ideology that Hayat Tahrir Sham carries and how they're going to treat people, whether they are minorities or not minorities. Of course, we're worried about the Christians, the Armenians, the Assyrians inside Aleppo. It's a very diverse city that has many different communities. We're also afraid about the Sunnis themselves, because just because Hayat Tahrir Sham is a Sunni group, that doesn't mean it treats the Sunni community fairly as well. They usually treat in a better way those who are or who support their ideology, but anyone who is different than them, and we've seen that in Idlib as well. People are being imprisoned and tortured under the control of Hayat Tahrir Sham. So I don't think that the situation tomorrow will necessarily be better. The Syrian regime, of course, has an oppression on an industrial scale because they have the state institutions under their control. But also Hayat Tahrir Sham proved to also be as oppressive in many different ways.
And it's a regime that also has the ability to call on large fighting machines like Russia, playing support here as they have in the past. How likely are Russia to be called upon again to assist the Assad regime?
I think that's very likely, Anthony. I do expect the regime to need the support of Russia. And here I do want to highlight that the Syrian regime, was about to fall in many different points over the last decade, when we're talking about 2011 onwards, when the war broke out in Syria. In 2013, the Iranians intervened through Hezbollah to prop up the Assad regime. And in 2015, the Russian intervened directly in September 2015 to support Assad, and over the years that followed, it was to Moscow that Assad owes everything that he is staying in power. And today, I think the rapid collapse happened because of the weakness that the Iranian militias has in Syria today, and also because Russia is mainly busy and overwhelmed with the war in Ukraine.
Ibrahim, thanks so much. Ibrahim Al-Assil, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington. Great to have your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, Robert S. Ford is a Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington. He also served as the US Ambassador to Syria from 2011 to 2014. You're a great resource for us to have at this moment. Robert, I wonder, the Syrian government seems to have been taken by surprise by this rebel offensive. Did you see this coming?
No, I don't think anyone saw it coming. Perhaps the Turks in Ankara knew that it was going to be launched, but Russia was surprised, the Syrian government obviously surprised, and I think Western observers were as well.
With that in mind, if we're trying to reverse engineer this, why do you think now? What gave these forces the opportunity to strike, apparently with the element of surprise and ultimately with great success?
Well, the most important element that has changed on the ground in Syria over the past months is the weakening of one of the key external supports for the Bashar al-Assad government, that is to say, Lebanese Hezbollah and various Iranian-backed militias that operate in northern Syria. Some of them are Iraqi, some of them are Afghan, some of them are Pakistani. The Israelis have hit them hard over the past months. They've hit Hezbollah very hard over the past months. The Israelis have disrupted border crossings so that it was harder for Lebanese Hezbollah to move back and forth between Lebanon and this part of Syria. And we can't forget that Russia is focused much more on Ukraine than it is on Syria. And over the past years, the Russians have thinned out their military forces in Syria. And so Assad's external supports are weaker, and hence they cannot rush in to help the Syrian army, which at the best of times is never very effective.
To what extent have the Russians pulled back, Robert? We know whereabouts in the world they're now busy fighting in Ukraine. How much of an influence is that potentially having at this moment?
The key thing to watch is the Russian Air Force. The Russians have always used primarily their air assets in Syria, based at a place called Hmeimim, not so far from Aleppo by air. We haven't seen a surge in Russian Air Force ground attack over the last 2 days. The Russians actually have done very little. And my guess is that is not because they seek the downfall of Bashar al-Assad. Rather, it is that they don't have a lot of air assets.
So forgive me for asking you to crystal ball, but how do you think this is going to play out over the coming days and weeks?
Well, I don't think this is Afghanistan and a repeat of Kabul anytime soon. Aleppo is still over 350 kilometers north of the capital city, Damascus. And unlike Afghanistan, the Syrian opposition is not nearly so united. To give you an example, your report was talking about various Islamist and less Islamist, more secular fighting groups among the opposition. That's absolutely true. And we didn't even begin to talk about Syrian democratic forces led by a Syrian Kurdish militia backed by the United States, which does not like these Islamist elements that have advanced on Aleppo. And I can imagine that if the militants expand their reach east into Kurdish areas, we'll have new battles there. And so I don't think this battle portends an end to the Syrian civil war.
Yeah, another very complex front opens up. Robert S. Ford, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington. Thanks so much for your insights at this moment.
Thank you.
Aaron Zelin is a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. One of his areas of expertise is the history of Syrian jihadism. Welcome to the day. Now, the government seems to have been taken by surprise by this rebel offensive. Did you see it coming?
I think everybody that's following Syria is surprised in terms of how swiftly they've been able to take over territory. Not that there necessarily would have been an offensive, because there have been rumors going back to early October that the Assad regime would actually try and take territory from HTS, but instead it looks like HTS preempted this now.
Why do you think they launched their attack precisely now?
Well, I think part of it is that they've been building up a lot of military strength over the last few years as there's been this so-called ceasefire or frozen conflict in Syria since 2020. And I also think that they probably were waiting for some of the issues related to Israel, Lebanon, Gaza to slow down so that it didn't seem as if they were on the same side as Israel. And therefore, this is seemingly independent of what's going on in that theater.
Mm-hmm. How related would you say it is to what's happening in Ukraine? Now, zooming out a bit.
Well, I mean, the fact that Russia is obviously very preoccupied there. There have been questions about the fact that, you know, Russia has done airstrikes over the last couple of days, but it hasn't been at the same pace or intensity that we've seen in the past, which is interesting considering the fact that just weeks ago, if not a few months ago, there was large-scale, Russian Air Force attacks against civilian populations in Idlib province where HTS is based. So there are a lot of questions related to the response now.
Mm-hmm. Let's answer some of those. How big a role do you expect Russia to be willing and able to play here in support of the Assad regime?
I think they've continued to have assets and key advisors and military individuals within Syria, even as they've expanded their campaign within Ukraine. But it's also important to remember that beyond Ukraine, Russia's actually expanded its operations within sub-Saharan Africa as well. The key, I think, in terms of beyond just the Air Force aspect of it, is whether Iran and its Shia militia network in Iraq are able to help out on the ground, because there are a lot of the key actors that helped push the opposition and the insurgency back previously in this region. And because Hezbollah is quite weakened now as a consequence of Israel's actions in Lebanon, one of the key questions now going forward is whether Iran will try and rely on maybe the Houthis now to do something, because they seemingly seem to be the strongest of those within the resistance axis today.
Mm-hmm. If the rebels have indeed entered Aleppo, we haven't been able to independently verify that. What would that mean? And what would that mean for what happens going forward?
It would be a huge victory for HTS and build up its own legitimacy within the opposition. There are a lot of questions related to HTS because of its past linkages, not only to the Islamic State, but also Al-Qaeda. Of course, they've disaffiliated with them, both groups, over the last 8 to 10 years. But it would be quite monumental considering the fact that the regime's victory in Aleppo in 2016 was sort of the beginning of the end of what many saw as the regime victory over the original uprising in 2011. So if HTS, as well as its allies on the ground, are able to do this, this could reanimate the broader insurgency against the regime, not just in the Aleppo region, but potentially in the south and Dar region, as well as other areas of the country as well.
With a historian's perspective, how do you expect it to go over the coming days and weeks?
I suspect that the regime, the Russians, Iran, as well as all the various Shia militias will continue to try and push back. One of the key question marks going forward is how much activity Turkey will get into this. Of course, they back a different grouping of rebel groups in northern Syria, Syrian National Army, or the SNA, and whether they get involved in this operation as well, and how much that could then assist HTS. And if that's the case, we could be back at some of the same dynamics we saw maybe from 2012 to 2014, where a lot of the opposition are able to control territory again in larger parts of Syria.
That's a troubling prospect. Aaron Zelin with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.